making references in any detail to those. And anybody who's served in Northern Ireland would be wise to make a declaration at this point, which I do as a former officer in Northern Ireland. I acknowledge Richard Drax also served, and Stuart Anderson as well. Thank you very much indeed. That's for the record. Mr. Mercer, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Lots to get through, very pertinent as well, given the fact that references were made to what is going on in Northern Ireland in the Queen's speech as well. But to begin the session today, I can invite Stuart Anderson to opening up the questions.
Thank you, Chair. Johnny, if you can set out for us how you think the government has done in fulfilling its manifesto pledge to veterans so far.
Look, I think that it's clear under this Prime Minister that there is a renewed focus on veterans, which I very much welcome. It's why I supported him, and I believe that he, as an individual, is deeply committed to this agenda. I think delivering on that so that it's not about announcements and what we sort of pour into the top of the machine, but what it feels like to be a veteran in this country today still has quite a long way to go. And for me, the kind of totemic symbol of that is what's gone on over the last few weeks. I think, Stuart, we have made progress. Okay, you cannot dispute that progress. But for me, the progress clearly was far too slow. It was very difficult. Working for government was very, very difficult. Getting this agenda anywhere was very difficult. I was very rarely allowed to speak about it in the media and things like that, which is hard when you've got 2.2 million veterans in this country who are really looking at you to deliver on this commitment for the Prime Minister. So it was difficult, but I think we've made some progress, but obviously nowhere near what I would have liked to have done as a Minister in the government.
Okay, can I just join a few of those dots there? You said that you believe the Prime Minister is committed to supporting veterans, and then you talked about the trouble of working within government. And the question that I was looking is, how effective has the government been, not just the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, pretty poor all round, to be honest. I mean, my existence was marked by a lot of engagement with the veteran community, whether that is those who've just left of our generation, or indeed those who left many years ago. Not only them, but their families, right? So, and as an example, I would, people know that I really wanted to tackle veteran suicide, and I would try and meet the families and, next of kin of everybody who took their own lives, because I wanted to understand sort of if there was any moment we could or should have intervened in that individual's life to prevent that. And often the answer was no. Suicide is deeply complex. But one of the biggest challenges was where individuals would take their lives and they would make a video before they did saying that there's no help available. And I would go to the area and I would look at the help, and the help was available. So the big issue was getting that message out. And I would then share that, obviously, with Number 10 and the people around the Prime Minister, and want to go and talk about that so that we get to a stage where people are not thinking there's no help available and taking their lives. And again, I was never sort of allowed to do that, to a point where I after seeing one family, it had such an effect on me. I just grabbed a journalist and went to a local hotel and gave them an interview because I thought it was so important to get the message out about what help is available for veterans. So, and when you're doing that, certainly in government, it's very lonely, you're very isolated, and it's very difficult. And, as far as I'm concerned, we should work as a team. This is not my hobby horse, it's the nation's duty to her veterans. I know it's the Prime Minister's expectation we deliver that, but clearly between myself and the Prime Minister, there was quite a contested space that I found difficult to win.
Okay, thank you for the honesty there. The Office of Veteran Affairs, had that made a difference since its formation to now?
So the concept of the Office for Veterans Affairs undoubtedly is a step change in what we do in veterans care in this country, but it has to be done in the correct way. You can't just have an Office for Veterans Affairs, release the press release, and then not do anything about it. You have to empower it properly. It has to have the correct number of people. It has to have the correct budget. It has to have the correct political horsepower from the Prime Minister. It can't just be a sort of bolted on to the most junior minister in the Ministry of Defence. Because essentially, you're looking to work cross-party, cross government, where you're dealing with secretaries of state, whether it's Grant Shapps and the Veterans Rail Card, or Rob Jenrick at MHCLG. Not only that, but with the devolved authorities as well, right? And if you are the most junior minister in defence and it's seen as a bit of a tokenistic effort, that job is going to be nigh on impossible.
Can I comment? You said if it's seen as a tokenistic effort, do you think it was a tokenistic effort?
No, I think there was a genuine ambition from this Prime Minister to get veterans' care right. And I've had a lot of criticism from my support of the Prime Minister, but that is my honest view, is that he gets this agenda and he wants to deliver on it. But we've had COVID and Brexit and all these things, and he's an incredibly busy man, but he should expect his ministers to operate within that lane of delivering his promises to our veterans.
Was the OVA properly funded? Or did it have enough funding?
Funding in the OVA is not a straightforward conversation, because the OVA is not a delivery mechanism. It's about pulling together all of the different strands. So, for example, Op Courage in the NHS, £16 million rising to £22 million in 5 years' time. You could argue that is veterans funding from the OVA, right? But the OVA is there to pull together all these strands of government and encourage the third sector, which has delivered all this care for so long, and actually make it work for the veteran. And it doesn't need a huge budget to do that. It doesn't need a huge workforce. It doesn't need a huge department. But it does need the kind of drive and authority to deliver it on the Prime Minister's behalf. And it certainly didn't have that. And I hope that changes in the weeks ahead.
What was your biggest ask within the OVA? And if you were still the Minister, what was the biggest thing you'd be asking for? I'm not talking about Northern Ireland or anything. We'll come on to that in a minute. To help the OVA really fulfil its task.
Just for it to be correctly politically priorities. I mean, when I left, we still didn't have an office.
Okay.
We'd been through 4 saving rounds already. It was extraordinary. At one stage, all the staff had been taken and I had no idea about it, and it was just myself and David Richmond left. And it took me 2 years to get a meeting with the Prime Minister, yeah. And if you're delivering what is a key manifesto promise, not only that, but the difficult stuff around the overseas bill and things like that, you've just got no chance of getting out the starting block.
Thanks.
Richard Drex, then John Speller.
Johnny, you've explained the difficulties you had. I'm not quite sure I'm personally satisfied as to why. The Prime Minister makes a pledge. You've talked in the last 5 minutes about you rebuffed at every single turn. Why on earth would our own government go to this length to not deliver for our brave men and women who are so essential and so important and do so much for our country? I just don't understand why you had this huge difficulty.
Largely, Richard, because everybody understands that we want to look after our veterans. Everybody wants to do that. You won't find an MP in this place who doesn't want to do that. But what it actually requires is beyond that, a real granular, detailed understanding of, for example, what's there at the moment. How do the charities interact? How do we negotiate mental health contracts with the NHS? How do we deliver things like a Veterans Rail Card? That requires another level of attention to detail that brings it into a strata that ultimately people were not prepared to pay it the attention it deserved.
No, but on mental health, for example, you were told you can't go out and explain.
Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary.
Why?
It was extraordinary.
I ask the question again, why?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, in that case, an individual, and I'm very clear on this, I'm not going after individuals, but I will tell you the truth of how the system works, okay? A senior individual, number 10, phoned me up and said, you're not to do the Today programme talking about veterans' mental health. And I said, I think I recall saying to him, has the Prime Minister specifically said that to you? Because I didn't believe he would say that. And he was like, the Prime Minister specifically told me you're not to do that tomorrow. So I spoke to the Prime Minister and he'd made no such pledge at all. So, you know, when you're operating in an environment where advisors, unelected advisors, ironically, who you know, I never profess to be the arch of all knowledge on the economy or green policies, but I don't think you'll find many people in this place who know more about veterans policies than myself. All I wanted to do was to was to deliver that, and in a sensible way that was cognizant of the fact we have COVID and Brexit all the time. But advisors would say this is not politically the right thing to do. This is not a political priority, and I'd be thinking to myself, that's not what as I understand it. But as a junior minister, you've got no chance. The way the system it's kind of set up. You've got the Secretary of State and you've got his SPADs, and everyone sort of hovers around him, and everything's done on their terms, right? So as a junior minister, you've got absolutely no chance, which I think is a shame, because I people like me just want to be part of a team that's delivering this stuff, right? I don't want to be constantly sort of looking at my boss trying to get his job or anything like that. I actually just want to deliver this stuff that and then go home and spend time with my family like anyone else who goes to work. But it was a really, really challenging time. And when I did speak up, I got in a fair amount of trouble, I think it's fair to say.
Can
I be a bit clearer on that? So are you saying that it was the civil service or the military command, the chain of command, that was blocking you, or it was the fringe sort of special advisors, both within the department and in Number 10? Because certainly with the former, you would have been able to say,
yeah,
I'm appointed by the Prime Minister as a Minister of the Crown, and this is the mandate I'm working on from the Prime Minister,
yeah,
and we're going to go ahead with it.
So I must say, in my experience, the civil service were extraordinarily flexible, capable, determined, and looked after me very well. And I must say, they would never say this in public, but they absolutely 100% aligned to my views, that we could not understand, for example, why, having met a grieving widow and her son who was 9 years old, right, why, if we had been offered a spot to speak in the media about what's available to stop people taking their own lives, we couldn't understand why that didn't happen. I'm afraid, in my view, special advisors in the round, there are one or two very good ones, but in the round, they sort of go from department to department, from the communications industry into something else. If there was a real skill set there, it would be really helpful, because there's no way the minister can know and do everything. But the idea that as a special advisor with absolutely no background in the military, never won anything in politics or anything like that, can come and tell me what they think is the best political route through, for example, for the overseas bill, is ridiculous. And any private company would just fall over, because you've got unqualified people giving pretty important advice. So look, I think there's some great special advisors and they do some really important work. But it's all a balance. And if it gets out of balance and they're controlling everything and they don't knock on doors and they don't know what it takes to be elected, then I'm afraid the system doesn't work as it should, and you end up not delivering what you said you would deliver.
But in a way, in order to resolve that, isn't it sort of incumbent on the ministers, basically, to say, the Prime Minister has the ultimate say. If he rings me up and tells, he's extremely busy and names a senior person, in our operation I'd have said, if Jonathan Powell or Alistair Campbell rings up, I understand they're speaking for the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Absent that,
yeah,
I'll go ahead and do it, unless he tells me not to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the traditional argument I had was that they'd always say Number 10 said no. So I would then say, no, but I would then say, well, who in Number 10? Because I would then try and go after them. And they'd just like, Number 10. And I'd be like, what, like the door? Right, the door says no. And literally you sort of couldn't get beyond that. And, when I was dealing with these policies, we hit some really tough times, whether combat stress, reorganising, whether the overseas bill, we had a spike in suicide in veterans in January 2019. Any of these issues, the country expects her elected ministers to go out and face these issues now. It's not all about, saying good things from the dispatch box. You need to tackle the difficult stuff as well and provide leadership on these issues. And at every stage, that was blocked. And I personally, so I had that on one side, you see, and then 2.2 million veterans in this country who see me finally get into government and deliver an OVA with this huge expectation. And then in the middle was literally just me. And that pressure was pretty overwhelming, and I mean, my wife wanted me to leave government some time ago.
Just one final question, Chair, is are we possibly seeing a divergence in policy between what you describe as the views of the Ministry of Defence civil service and possibly the broader Whitehall complex who might take a different view from MOD, which is not unknown?
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, in other words, that Treasury and the Cabinet Office may take a different view than the Ministry of Defence, who actually have to engage with the problem, and therefore this is a vehicle by which they are exerting their view.
So what I found interesting, and look, I'd be the first to accept that I didn't take my sacking particularly well, but what I found, that would be okay if everybody told the truth. So I went round the department from the Secretary of State downwards trying to find out who arrived at this figure of 72,000 in the army. And everyone blamed each other. I just, private enterprises can't operate like that. If you're going to make difficult decisions, you've got to own it, and you've got to see it through. And I tried for a long time to find out, because my personal view was that it's very difficult to make a promise at election time about numbers, okay, and then a year and a half later very clearly breach that promise, right? Politically, that is very difficult. The doctrine side of it, of course, we can do more with less, and there's some brilliant stuff in that IR that the Secretary of State worked really hard on. But yeah, going around to try and find that, you're right. Yeah, of course, there's divergence of thinking, and I tried to find out from Treasury ministers and officials who arrived at this number, from people in the army, from ministers in my department, and literally no one could tell me a straightforward answer. So it's quite difficult to operate in an environment like that, I think.
Thanks, Chair.
Mark. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mercer, you talked about the Prime Minister being fully behind the veterans' agenda. I think we would probably agree with that. But on a specific question, in the summer of 2020, when he was standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party, when he was
2019. He's standing for the leadership.
Yes, sorry, yes. When he was in a runoff against another candidate.
Yes.
Sorry, you're quite right. He published a double-page spread, I think, in The Sun, where he signed a veterans' pledge. Amongst other things, he promised in that pledge to bring in legislation by the next general election that would protect veterans, including Northern Ireland veterans.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you mentioned Brexit, the pandemic. There were extraordinary circumstances that led to that election and what followed. Do you believe that the Prime Minister is still committed to that pledge that he signed in The Sun?
I mean, he's committed to it, right? But of course, it hasn't been delivered. I mean, this is not my opinion. It's in black and white. The pledge is very clear in black and white, and we have not delivered that in black and white. The pledge from the start didn't really kind of get off the starting blocks. Yes, we legislated for the overseas bill, but by the end of that process, I'm afraid, we can talk about that another time, but it became nothing like it was designed to be, and we lost complete control of it. The Veterans Minister in every other Five Eyes country sits in the Cabinet, where he can deal with other Cabinet colleagues and actually deliver policy. That was part of the Veterans Pledge. Legislation to protect servicemen in Northern Ireland was part of the Veterans Pledge, and we have not delivered on those things. So, look, I think he is committed to these things. I think there was strong and immediate pushback to the Prime Minister when he signed that pledge from people around him. Well, I know that there was. And I know there was a strong pushback against me as well.
Are you at liberty to say who pushed back?
No, Mark. I'm afraid I'm not. I'm very clear that I want to achieve an objective in this policy space. I absolutely have no axe to grind or personal battles to fight with anybody. For me, it is. I know I've been critical, but I've never gone after an individual, because I just want the system to work and deliver for veterans.
Okay, we're going to come back to the Queen's speech in a few minutes, so We'll leave it there for the moment. But I assure you we will return to that.
Good.
Thank you. Chairman.
Mark, thank you for that. I'd just like to pursue that a bit further. You're aware that I did your job before you.
I am aware of that.
And
I did it before him.
And this challenge as to how we look after our veterans who have served their country well, who've been put into situations that civilians perhaps cannot necessarily directly relate to. They go there, absolutely the majority of them, and honour the Geneva Convention. And absolutely, those who don't must be held to account. But I, in my time, could not find any legal instrument that would allow us to somehow protect those veterans and still abide by the human rights law, still abide by the Good Friday Agreement, and still abide by the legislative process that is followed in the Northern Ireland Assembly, which would require any new legislation having the support of Sinn Féin. They simply would not tolerate us supporting one part of society, namely veterans, without it being equal to those who are the civilians that were also involved in the Troubles. Yeah. And yet here we are in December 2019, in the general election build-up, on Armistice Day, making a pledge to say we are going to solve this. Now, I don't disagree with the passion that you articulate in the Prime Minister wanting to get this resolved. Would you now agree that he was badly advised to say that this was possible, that this could be done, and that's ultimately what's led to your resignation?
So no, I don't agree with that, actually, Chair, because I think there are options available in this space, and my views have been persistently misrepresented by individuals who are trying to sort of advance their aims, and I respect that. But actually, this committee's probably done the best work on legacy. In 2018, the report came out in 2018.
I don't want to get distracted. My question is very straightforward.
Was he badly advised to sign that pledge?
Where is the legal instrument? Okay, and we're now moved on from that in the Queen's speech itself, which we're going to come on to shortly. But clearly, we've now drawn a line to say there wasn't any capability, there wasn't any legal avenue. I discussed this with the Attorney General and with the Northern Ireland office at length, and nobody could find a way through this difficult avenue to plough a furrow which would be acceptable to all the players, all the stakeholders involved. And that's my concern, is that we made a pledge, that the Conservative Party made a pledge in the general election, raising that bar, telling all those veterans that you mentioned a number of times that we're going to solve this. When in my time I couldn't do this, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of.
So it's a completely fair question, and and I've heard commentary sort of saying that I was naive to believe the Prime Minister and so on. I think people who in this space have worked for many years before me, before yourself and others. There are policies available to do this. So. The report in 2018, for example, laid that out. Richard Eakins in Policy Exchange, Tom Tugendhat wrote a paper in 2014. There are studies that have been done to this. So whilst I accept what you're saying, there was no legal mechanism. You can pull off the shelf, insert it into Northern Ireland and sort it out.
But then why was there an Overseas Operations Bill which excluded Northern Ireland?
The Overseas Operations Bill excluded Northern Ireland because there was a decision was made by the Northern Ireland office that it would not get any traction in Northern Ireland at all. But it was done with a very clear promise that they would walk down simultaneous legislation so that when we got to the end of that process, we had not created two tiers of veterans. So those who served like I did and those who served in Northern Ireland who are older than me. We have now, whatever we like and say, we sit here today in this country with two tiers of veterans. Those who are protected by the Overseas Bill and those who are not, and those who served in Northern Ireland. That is unacceptable to any average citizen in this country.
As the Minister, if you see these things that are plug and play, ready to fit, policy exchange proposals and so forth, how come you didn't say, let's go, let's run with that, let's utilise that, it seems to work? Because, as I say, others before you tried many mechanisms and could not find one that would actually succeed and get through the legislative channels and challenges that you'd face.
I think because to get this stuff through, there are critical appointments where you need people who genuinely understand the intricacies of legacy and what you're going to do to deliver on it. Okay, and they are generally at a more senior level than you and I were at when we were serving in the same position in the Ministry of Defence. If you are going to talk about legacy, you have to tread very, very carefully, very sympathetically, and with a lot of grace. And I had 16 meetings in Northern Ireland.
I don't doubt any of that. But I'm asking, what is the legislation that you wanted to put there?
Yeah. So if you can do that, and you can engage with all these groups, and that is the critical thing, to bring people in Northern Ireland with you. All these different groups that I met last week, families, veterans, across the political divide as well. If you can all agree on a set of principles, for example, where new evidence exists, that we will prosecute people, okay, and we won't have an amnesty because we don't want people going around bragging, committing murder. Okay, there are mechanisms in place. For example, the presumption not to prosecute that Geoffrey Cox came up with as Attorney General is very effective. You have a qualified statute of limitations, which is not a statute of limitations. It is a qualified statute of limitations. These sort of mechanisms you can bring them in, but you need people who are leading that policy who really understand it and understand the detail. And have the sensitivities to bring everybody with them.
With respect, that was you and that was me
in
my time.
No, it's not.
And what we're now seeing is that all this is being abandoned. So whatever you see before, we've heard today, which we can now move on to, is the fact that the statute of limitations that's being proposed is for everybody. It's for the victims. It's also those who are non-in-uniform and those in uniform. That's the big difference between what is being proposed in the Queen's speech today and where we were before.
So Chair, that I hate to correct you, but that is not correct. That is not correct. The words in this Queen's speech are almost identical to the ones that were in last year's and the year before that, and they all talk about the equivalence across the scale of delivering for veterans and victims and survivors. So that is not correct, and that's why this space is difficult.
I checked with the MOD before we began this session, and I was directed at the Times trail on this on the weekend, which absolutely talked about the fact that there's going to be a new form of statute of limitations, but it will not just focus on veterans, which would be unacceptable to the Sinn Féin and therefore would not get through the Northern Ireland Assembly.
The truth is, we don't know what it will say because we haven't seen the bill yet. Regardless of what the Times have been told or not told, none of us will know what is actually proposed until we've seen the bill. With respect, that's the whole point.
Well, that's what I'm putting to...
Just because someone in the Times has written something and they've had a briefing from a SPAD doesn't mean it's true.
Well, it wasn't a SPAD. I'm not going to get into a debate with you. We're here to question the former minister to say that, as a direction I received from the MOD, is that this is direction of travel. Would you
but
be
it's not
content
their
with
bill,
it?
Chair.
Mark, you please...
That's the point, isn't it?
Mark, forgive me. I'm asking my question, and if you don't mind, I'll do that uninterrupted. If it is the case that the Times rollout
about, Chair, is equivalence.
Would you accept that or not?
So what we have to do is understand and accept that there is absolutely no equivalence between those who don a uniform, sign up to the services and try and prevent civil war in Northern Ireland, and those who deliberately get up in the morning to go and murder women and children. There will never be any moral equivalence in that space. But we do have to accept that we are all equal under the law. And within that space, we have to find a policy that provides truth and reconciliation where it can, but also certainty for veterans. Now, that is not undeliverable. That is not undeliverable, but it requires a political commitment that we have not seen to date.
Okay, well, let's see what the government does produce. That'll be very interesting indeed. Let's move forward. Sarah Atherton, over to you.
Relatively short tenure as Veterans Minister, you've actually achieved quite a lot. The Armed Forces Covenant, the Rail Card, identification of veterans at the census, charity funding during COVID, guarantee interview scheme, the Overseas Ops Bill. Quite a lot, well done. What's your proudest moment?
I hope that the Office of Veterans Affairs, if it is correctly empowered, and correctly prioritised politically by the Prime Minister, will be a strategic step change in how this country delivers veterans. Because through that vehicle, you can pull together all the different strands, right? You've got a third sector where demand's going through the roof, but their money and everything else is going through the floor. You have a statutory provision that is only going to increase because we have a duty in this country to our veterans, and people like Simon Stevens in the NHS have ensured they looked after. So we're on this journey. If the Office of Veterans Affairs can get in that space, really organise and provide leadership in that space for what veterans need, then it's a game changer, and we will be the best country in the world to be a veteran. The trouble is that needs the political horsepower to be able to do that, to negotiate, to talk to the NHS about contracts with combat stress, to actually deliver things like the Overseas Bill by itself, which predominantly affects veterans. If they are empowered to deliver that, then it's a much easier progress. The Overseas Bill, the narratives that were developed around that were just obscene, and I felt it very personally. I mean, the individual who sent a soiled nappy to my wife was objecting to the Overseas Bill because apparently I liked torturing people. Now, clearly, but I was never really allowed to go out and advocate in that space and talk about why that was absurd. So you just need, it's all about political priorities. Every other Five Eyes country's got a cabinet minister who's responsible for veterans. We're the only one who doesn't. We were the last to have the Office for Veterans Affairs. Okay, and this needs to change. This is not my hobby horse. This is the nation's duty. The nation's duty to these people. And at some point, I've no doubt we will realise it, because the great British public, I'm afraid, give millions of pounds to this because they recognise that veterans in this country are not looked after properly. And at some point, politicians will align with that. I just want us to get there sooner rather than later. And there's a big political capital to it as well.
So you spoke about that veteran space and getting in there and having the opportunity to do that. I know it's a very complex situation, as you've just explained, but why didn't you do it? What regret have you got? And what simply could change that?
Because I was totally unsupported. And whilst my civil service team and my private office and others and the Prime Minister personally were very supportive, the government is a huge system. And in order to get things done, you need to be empowered to deliver things in your space. If you operate in a system where essentially you are kind of the face on the policy, but you have no real power over the policy levers that are pulled, it will get very difficult and very messy. And I had some very difficult conversations with my Secretary of State, for example, around the Overseas Bill, which in the end was nothing that I, or indeed, there were elements of it that will provide a degree of protection, don't get me wrong, but the whole narrative just completely ran away with itself. And that was a result of direct and deliberate decisions, that frankly were made against the advice of myself and civil servants and legal teams in the department. So
I'm going to go on to Northern Ireland legacy later, but we're undertaking a subcommittee on...
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't come. I ejected just before your committee, didn't I? I'm sorry.
Were you surprised at some of the evidence that we've received?
Yeah, it's shocking. Shocking. The female experience in the military is still nowhere near where it should be. There are females in the military who have a wonderful experience, without a shadow of a doubt, and maybe you were one of them, right? But the statistics and the sort of narrative evidence around it would lend it to being a significant problem as to how we treat women in the military. And, my eldest daughter wants to join my regiment, right? And would I be comfortable with her joining? Yes, I would, because, I could have some degree of control around that. But you read some of the experiences of our females, and it is still not good enough. That's why I wanted to come and give evidence, because I'd listened to all the evidence sessions. I want everyone who goes into the military to have as great a time as I did, right? And to really look back on it as the most sort of promising time in their life. And it absolutely breaks my heart when I meet women or the LGBT community or foreign and Commonwealth personnel who just want to get away from it as fast as they can. That's not what the military is about.
Do you think rape trials should be heard in a civilian court?
Look, I'm not. I had a different policy position to the Secretary of State on that, but I don't want to sort of. I'm happy to declare that I had a different view, but I'm not happy to go into sort of private conversations with the Secretary of State.
I'll try another one, Johnny, if you don't mind. The chain of command hasn't come out very well in the evidence. Do you think that there is scope to remove the chain of command from military complaint system?
I think the way that complaints go through the chain of command is clearly not working, right? And you need some sort of independent method of redress. But you have to be very careful around that redress, because the military is a different organisation. It's not Tesco, right? People will be asked to do stuff they don't want to do, and so they will inevitably have grievances. We need to find a balance in the middle where we are fair to people, but the needs of the military come first because of the nature of the organisation. So I don't think it's quite as black and white as is laid out, but I think there's a strong argument to be heard around an independent complaints process, which there is with the Service Complaints Ombudsman, right? But obviously it takes far too long and it is not providing good enough outcomes for our people.
All right, thanks, Johnny. Chair.
Can I just commend the work that Sarah's done on this subcommittee? She's pioneered it. The rest of the committee have supported, but she's done an incredible job. I think it's going to be quite illuminating what we've uncovered. You said you didn't get an opportunity, because you stepped back prior to you attending. If you do want to put anything in writing yourself, I'm sure Sarah would be delighted to hear it. Before we move on to the next question, you mentioned the job of Veterans Affairs and the Five Eyes community.
Yeah.
I mean, we often compare ourselves with the United States, where they have a complete separate setup. Yeah. But that's also partly because of the NHS structures, the support mechanisms that are there for veterans.
Yeah.
I think we can be very proud. I hope you'd agree. Just let me finish. With the construct that is there, and perhaps that's why the Veterans Affairs machinery is of less of a calibre than compared with others. So we need to bear that in mind. In the United States, if you visit some of the veterans' hospitals, if you've ever had a chance to do that, you'll know that they're actually not as good as others. They have a different insurance policy system there, very different to the NHS as well. I think that just needs to be kept into perspective.
Oh, look, we do not want to replicate what the United States does to her veterans. Yeah. Okay, and at no stage do we want to replicate essentially any other country. We have the NHS. We have good lines of care for our service personnel in the NHS, but it does need a command and control structure. Okay, you cannot go to Plymouth and receive a wonderful experience because you're an Armed Forces veterans and go somewhere else in the country and they'll be like, no, I haven't heard of that. You're just going to have to wait like everyone else for your treatment for
but you said
PTSD or whatever.
You said there was no office. I think, looking around the room, some of us actually attended a drinks reception in the Office of Veterans Affairs.
That wasn't the Office of Veterans Affairs.
What was that? Do you remember that?
It was the cabinet. It was
a cabinet office.
It was Michael Gove's office.
Yeah. I see. Right. Okay. That clarifies.
Michael's responsible for a lot of things. He deserves a very big office.
Right. Well, let's move on. Mark Francois, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Johnny, to some degree, this debate's happening in a vacuum because, as is evident, we don't know what the precise proposals in this bill will be. But in today's Queen's speech, the wording was as follows. I quote, "Measures will be brought forward to strengthen devolved government in Northern Ireland and address the legacy of the past." End quote. So that is the position as of today. Now, you've made the point that there's been similar wording in previous Queen's speeches and yet no legislation has emerged. So it could be argued that we've been rather like the grand old Duke of York, marched up to the top of the hill a number of times and marched down again. Do you think the same is true now, or do you really think we're going to see a bill now in the next few weeks?
Look, Mark, if I had thought legislation was going to be forthcoming on this, I would not have left government. I didn't want to leave government. It was hard, right? But I did not want to leave government. But the truth is, on that very day I left, I asked my Secretary of State if he had seen a single word committed to paper on these proposals, and the answer was no. Okay, so these things have been talked about for many, many years.
They have.
Meanwhile, okay, last week in Belfast, in the trial in the Joe McCann case, it had to be seen to be believed. I mean, I thought it was bad before I went. Okay, but the judge was very clear. It wasn't on a knife edge, right? He was very clear. And what we've done to those men over the last 6 years is absolutely appalling. And I just cannot be part of an administration that is going to promise these people things and then not make almost any effort to deliver on them. And it may be my fault and my undoing, but I think these people deserve better than that. I hear their individual experiences of their spouses dying, of them getting ill, of colleagues drinking themselves to death, and I'm afraid they deserve a voice as much as anybody else. I respect everybody's campaigns in this place, and indeed I vote for some of them, right? But these guys deserve a voice as much as anybody else, and I'm afraid what I saw last week broke my heart. In that courtroom, I saw two men who were totally abandoned by their nation that they had fought for.
All right, let's assume just for a moment that you're wrong and that the government is going to bring in legislation within the next few weeks, just for the purposes of debate. We don't know what's in it. One thing we do know is that in March of last year, when the Overseas Operations Bill was published, because it didn't cover Northern Ireland veterans, the then Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis issued a written ministerial statement, I think from memory on the same day, that promised, and I'm checking the wording, equal treatment to that accorded to Iraq and Afghan veterans. That was the gist of, that was the spirit of what he said. The phrase was equal treatment. I checked it at the weekend. So if there is a bill, and if it offers equal treatment, which the Northern Ireland Secretary has told Parliament it will, then presumably all of those protections, for instance, no decision to prosecute without the consent of the UK Attorney General, would have to be in that Northern Ireland Bill as well in order for the government to have kept his word. Do you agree?
In order for the government to have kept its word in line with that statement in March, it will have to deliver, not through the same method, but the same outcome for service personnel who served in Northern Ireland as those who are protected by the Overseas Bill, which extends to the particular mechanism you are speaking of, yes.
Thank you. Now, in terms of what the solution may be, there have been suggestions in the media of some form of statute of limitations. Now, to be clear, that is not an amnesty, is it? Because my understanding, and I'd just like your confirmation, is the veterans don't want an amnesty because, in simple terms, that implies they're being forgiven for having done something wrong. Their view is they didn't do anything wrong, they were upholding the law in incredibly difficult circumstances. So a statute of limitations is not an amnesty, is it?
So the proposals that I saw last week that were referred to is a kind of Luddites politicians approach to this, where we'll just throw a word at it and hope that we can capture all things and just draw a clean line in this place, where that is not possible in Northern Ireland. A statute of limitations is different. A qualified statute of limitations is different.
With respect,
and that's the important moment. So a statute of limitations, a 5-year ban, right, or whatever it may be, I don't believe, and neither do the veteran community or anybody else I met in all my meetings in Northern Ireland, believe that it is fair that there is a time limit on justice. Right? But you cannot have new evidence come to light and for an individual not to be held to account. A qualified statute of limitations, where evidential thresholds have to be met, is deliverable and is, in my experiences last week, generally palatable to all sides if we can agree on what those mechanisms may be. Nobody really wants to see last week. The only people who want to see it are the lawyers who are sucking at a fire hose of public money. Even the McCann family was let down last week. That's unpalatable to some people, but even they were let down.
Well, can I press you specifically on a qualified statute of limitations? Because there is a legal way of solving this problem. The question is, will the government adopt it?
Yes.
So the defence, this is a complex issue. No one denies that, not least because of all the history. No one denies that. So this committee, in its previous iterations, looked into this issue twice and produced 2 very detailed reports. The first, I think, from memory in either 2015 or 16, and the second in 2019, drawing a line, protecting veterans by a statute of limitations. I think you served on that committee,
I did.
But you left before the report was published because by then you were in government. Is that right?
I was.
Right, okay, but you were there for part of the genesis of it.
I was there for all of the hearings. I just didn't. I wasn't allowed to change the report when it came out.
Okay, well that's
which I wouldn't have done.
Okay, that's very clear. So, if you like, the policy of this committee, or at least consistently across those 2 reports, has been to call for 1, a qualified statute of limitations. In other words, you do draw a line, but you can reinvestigate something that's already been investigated before, but only if there is compelling new evidence. That's the essence of why you say it's qualified. I've got that right.
You have got that right.
Thank you. So that was
There's more to it than that, but in simplistic terms.
But in essence, that's
yes.
it. Yeah, well,
yes.
With Northern Ireland, there's always more to it, but in essence, that's
yes.
it. And then the second key element, again recommended, I think, in both reports by this committee, is some form of truth recovery method, a la the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whereby people can come forward and talk about what happened, including what happened to the disappeared and people's loved ones 40 or 50 years ago, without fear of prosecution. And that was the other key element in the committee's report. Do you support those proposals?
I do, yes. I think broad swathes of the community in Northern Ireland would support those principles. I engaged across the political spectrum, Stand Fast Sinn Féin, the rest of the political spectrum in Northern Ireland, and there is a widespread acknowledgement that truth and reconciliation is as important a part of this as anybody else. And even, each family is different, each individual family is different, each victim is different. But in broad brush strokes, in the round, most families want to know what happened.
Yes.
They do not want to see 90-year-olds in prison for stuff they don't remember. And as politicians, we have a duty to deliver that.
I agree. A couple of quick more and then I'll hand back to the chair. So it is true, therefore, that there are potentially legally viable methods for solving this problem, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right, good. And is part of the difficulty here that when a decision was taken maybe 2 or 3 years ago to split the two bills so that the MOD would lead on the Overseas Operations Bill and the NIO would lead on the Northern Ireland Bill because of all the sensitivities in Northern Ireland, one can see to some extent why that decision was taken. But isn't it true that officials in the NIO have never really wanted to do this and they've been foot-dragging for years?
Mark, I am not going to go for people
I didn't mention any individual.
I know you didn't mention any individuals. I don't want to criticise specific sort of areas more than I need to. I think you make some very fair points. The biggest challenge in this space, right, is the kind of ill-informed debate, because people say very insensitive things that, of course, if it was my child who was killed, would wind me up. It needs skilled people to provide real leadership and statesmanship in this space. It is possible. Absolutely it is possible. But we have to change course and we have to do things differently. And we have to bring the community in Northern Ireland with us.
I agree. Finally, if the government produce a bill within the next few weeks, and it includes some form of qualified statute of limit, as with any parliamentary legislation, Johnny, the devil is in the detail. That's why we have a House of Commons and a House of Lords to scrutinise legislation line by line. That's part of our job. But in principle, if they bring in a bill in the next few weeks and it includes some form of qualified statute and limitations allied with a truth recovery mechanism, would you support that?
The broad principles, of course I would support that. I don't have... I've seen some ridiculous things written and said about what I'm after in this space. All I want is fairness. That's all I've wanted for veterans. And a fair process like that would be supported by veterans. Nobody in the veteran community, this is what people forget, nobody in the military wants individuals who cannot hold themselves to the standards that we tried so hard to maintain to be unaccountable. It damages everybody. To continue down that, I'm sort of bored of correcting people, really, because it's just following a political narrative. Ultimately, we want people held to account who break the law, but at the same time, we don't want the complete unfairness you see in the process at the moment. And I'm sure it's not beyond the wit of man to find a way down the middle where actually we can prosecute those who break the law and leave those alone to live their old age who've served in the military.
Look, this is not a competition. We all want to we all want to defend those who defended us. We're all approaching it from our different angles and our different capacities and the different posts that we hold or used to hold or do or don't hold. So on one level, I think hopefully we're all of good intent. But if they came up with a bill like that in the next few weeks with a QSOL and a truth recovery mechanism, you'd go through the ILOG.
Yeah,
right?
I'd be delighted. I'd be absolutely delighted if we could get something over the policy line. I'm aware that I resigned. I've done all these things to try and shift the dial, and the bill that was promised in the Queen's speech today did not materialise. So I've been unsuccessful. So I will do anything to be successful in this space, and I'd love to see any legislation for these people who deserve someone to stand up for them.
Well, no one doubts your passion on this. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mark. Just to pursue that a second, your proposal for a statute of limitations would only apply to those in uniform.
A qualified statute of limitations.
So who would that apply to?
Any law you brought in, you would. We are all equal under the law, and you would have to. You'd have to have very difficult conversations around applying it clearly on all sides. You cannot, in law, legislate to protect one group of people over another. Okay, there is no equality here. There is no sort of equivocation between terrorists and those who served in the military. But whether we like it or not, we are all equal under the law. And so, is this an amnesty to terrorists? Of course it's not, because if the evidence is there, right, these people will be prosecuted. So that's but it has to be equal, it has to be fair.
Very different language to what was being pursued under my time. There was never, ever a consideration to expand that out to those civilians on the other side of this equation. It was always focusing on veterans and to support those. And the statute of limitations, when we spoke to other MPs and colleagues and so on, let's protect our veterans. It wasn't anything to do with those who got caught up on the other side. Yeah. And it's interesting that you're expanding that out now, which is, I suspect, where the government is now about to go.
Well, it's always been my view, Chair. It's always been my view about Iraq and Afghanistan. You cannot legislate to protect one side in this. You've never been able to. And neither would I seek to.
No,
it's about fairness for everybody.
I don't doubt what you're saying here today, but can you confirm that wasn't the government's intent up to today? Because I'm not aware of it at all. In all the discussions I've had, and committee members can chip in if they want, I'm not aware of an intention to equal this out.
If I'm completely honest, Chair, that there hasn't been any real, deliberate, constructive, informed and really professional conversations about legacy that I've seen within government. Because if you try and get a policy like that off the starting blocks, can we protect people just because they served in the military? It is unlawful. And so anybody who operates in this space understands that's never going to get off the starting block. Legacy is not an issue you can just chuck politicians at and hope it's going to work. We have to understand the real detail.
I don't doubt that. This is the reality check in that we've had to go through. And can I just finish and come back, Mark, you can come back in. The other issue, which would you agree, is that this will be subject to Northern Ireland Assembly approval?
Oh, everything, it needs to be a Northern Ireland-led solution. Okay. But on equivocation, Tobias, we have to be very, very clear.
Right.
Never any moral equivocation between these two groups.
Right.
Okay, so but we are all equal under the law.
This is very, very fresh. It's good to hear because, as I say, in my time as a minister, this was never ever, considered to expand this out to include the other side. And clearly, you're going to bump into human rights law because it's illegal to separate and give exception to one part of society. Mark must come in, and I see Gavin also wanting to grab my mark.
Just quickly. This bill, because it's a UK bill from the UK Parliament, legally, my understanding is it does not require a legislative consent motion from the Northern Ireland Assembly by law.
That's correct.
That might be desirable, but it's not legally a requirement. So it doesn't have to have the assent of the Northern Ireland Assembly, but it might be politically desirable. So we clear that up. And secondly, you talked about equal treatment, but isn't part of the truth in this, all the way through, that several hundred alleged IRA terrorists were given so-called letters of comfort under the Blair government following the Good Friday Agreement? So I don't think any of those have ever then been successfully prosecuted for terrorist offences in a UK court. I think some may have been in a Republic of Ireland court, or even if some of them have, there have been very, very few. So for years we've had a situation where alleged IRA terrorists, metaphorically, had a letter of comfort in their pocket and they were off the hook even being reinvestigated, whereas Northern Ireland veterans were not. That is patently unfair, isn't it?
Yes. So if you just give me 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, they're not alleged terrorists. These are convicted killers, okay, who were convicted in Northern Ireland and released under the Good Friday Agreement. It has always been a long campaign to then move on from that to the next stage for people like the IRA. Mm-hmm. Okay, you now have, for example, people like Jerry Kelly, okay, who and his convictions, all right, who is now on the chair of the police board in Northern Ireland. Okay? The two individuals who were recommended by prosecution were recommended by Barry McCrory. Barry McCrory used to represent individuals involved with the Republican cause. Okay? I'm not making allegations, these are fact. The reality is, if you let the judicial system be used like that, where individuals have to make individual decisions on what is in front of them, of course, nobody would question their professional judgment. Okay? But you can't honestly tell me that just because there is a new prosecutor and we get a new decision, that is a fair way to treat veterans 50 years after the event.
Okay,
Thank you.
Can we bring in Gavin Robinson? Gavin, you've got the floor anyway, so do you want to then ask your supplementary and then move forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's just fair to reflect that where you were suggesting that this was a new reflection and didn't form part of the discussion when you were in ministerial office. It did form part of the original Defence Select Committee report. The Defence Select Committee report, given that we are the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, was focused primarily, but not exclusively, on the service of armed forces. There was a supplementary recommendation that asked government to extend that to the RUC and others who served within the security sphere, and another supplementary recommendation that said government may wish to consider how far this should expand beyond that. There was no exclusion to other participants in the course of the Troubles, but the clear distinction was that the state has an obligation under Article 2 to investigate, and where that obligation has been discharged, they should move on. There are many terrorists who have evaded justice over the last 40 years, who have not been questioned, never mind made amenable before the criminal justice system, and that's the distinction. Not that there should be an amnesty, but for those who have been satisfactorily investigated, move on. For those that haven't, they should still face justice.
Just quickly come back on that. It was being led by the Northern Ireland office during my time. That may have changed under Johnny Mercer's time, but certainly with Northern Ireland. But because the Veterans Minister gets the questions on this, it comes into your sort of portfolio, what's going on about it. But certainly in my time, there was no suggestion that this would be broadened out to the other side of the equation, even though the committee clearly did some interesting work on this, which sadly wasn't picked up, but looks like we might be going there now. Anyway, shall we move on to the wider issue?
Right. So,
do the
I will do.
bill?
Thank you, Chair. And that's right, that is the distinction. But that work was done by our committee, and I served on the committee in both the inquiries. Turning to Mr. Mercer, if we call him Mr. Mercer, it was good to see you in Belfast last week, and thank you for your continued interest in this. Do you agree that far from there being no legal avenue that could work in this situation, fundamentally it has failed because there's been a lack of political will, be that in Whitehall or in Belfast?
Well, that's precisely what it is, and that's why I left government. These things are all down to political will and what the political priorities of the day are. And there have been options available. There's been options available for a number of years. But like I've said many times, they require a commitment, a degree of leadership and statesmanship and ability that has not been there to date. And we owe it to these people, not only these people, but communities across Northern Ireland who don't want to read in their newspapers every single day of score settling and things like that through the courts. They want to get on with an amazing future that Northern Ireland could have, whilst putting in provisions for those who break the law to be held to account historically as well. These are not big asks. In my experience, why has it not happened? It's political priority, and I'm afraid people like you haven't had the platforms that I would like you to have had over the years. I think you've always had a very qualified view on legacy. As you know, we've all worked together on a cross-party basis on those committees. We've come up with very sensible proposals. The government hasn't done them.
And you shared with us, I think, fairly and frankly, that on the day or in the hours leading up to your resignation, you had asked the Secretary of State, had he seen a paper, had proposals been brought to him, and he answered in the negative. Throughout the course of the year, during the introduction of the Overseas Operations Bill and toward its conclusion and third reading, did you take it upon yourself to inquire on the progress of the Northern Ireland equivalent measures that were going to be brought forward? And if so, could you give us a sense of those discussions and how I imagine frustration grew?
So when the bill was first presented, I made it clear that I was not prepared to take the bill forward without a commitment on Northern Ireland from the Northern Ireland Secretary. That was forthcoming in his letter of the 18th of March that was presented. From that moment on, and indeed throughout my time in the department, I would every Monday have about 20 meetings back to back, just 15-minute meetings with all my departmental leads on specific policy areas. So whether it was the Veterans Gateway, mental health, the Office of Veterans Affairs, legacy, whatever it may be, and the Northern Ireland Office team within the MOD briefed me every single week. I'm not going to say what they said, but suffice to say there was no progress at all.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Was there progress throughout those weekly meetings, or did you get the same information delivered on a weekly basis?
Look, Gavin, I'll be completely honest with you. Even when I repeated, I made a video once, right, when I was getting a lot of criticism from veterans. I made a video once just repeating word for word what the Prime Minister has said at the dispatch box about Northern Ireland veterans and what was in our manifesto, word for word. Okay, and there was a formal complaint put into me to number 10, and I received the calls from Secretaries of State, chewing me out over it. It is about political priority. It's about sticking to your promises. And by the end, if I'm honest, I felt like I was the kind of last man in the room who believed that we should follow through on that, so I left.
It was mentioned earlier in our session that the commitment given during the leadership election was delivered on Armistice Day, I think, or at least perhaps by the Prime Minister then. Could I ask you, as a former Veterans Minister, to give your reflections on how appropriate you thought it was that without any detail and in briefing to the press, on Election Day last Thursday, this policy proposal was announced?
It was completely crass. I had 16 meetings over those 2 days, and you know that because I nearly fell asleep in mine with you. And one of the things that we actually agreed on, and that I gave my word to the families we would never do, is an amnesty. I flew home that night and saw it in the Times. To be honest, if I lived in Northern Ireland and I was treated like that, I'd be pretty annoyed as well.
A point of order, Mr. Chairman. Can we just confirm that it wasn't my fault that that Johnny nearly fell asleep?
You keep us on our toes, Gavin. There's no doubt about that.
Yes.
Are you
but just I think that's very powerful that you're reflecting. Have you had contact from veterans since then about how they felt in the aftermath? I mean, you've said how you feel about it.
Veterans
veterans have replied to you.
Veterans do not want an amnesty. To pretend otherwise is delusional.
And should the proposals emerge in the next number of weeks which amount to an amnesty rather than the qualified statute we have discussed, can I confirm then that you will not support such proposals?
I've never supported an amnesty. I've never argued for an amnesty. I've never argued for soldiers to be above the law. I just want fairness.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Gavin. John, over to you.
Incidents, you would be against that unless it was just for the armed forces?
I wouldn't support anything that was discriminatory, and I would not support anything that puts a time limit on prosecutions, irrespective of new evidence emerging. No.
Stuart, did you want to come back?
Yeah. You've left your position as a minister, as you said, it's very hard. Do you, hand on heart, believe we will see legislation come forward for Northern Ireland veterans in this Parliament?
So when you leave the government, I think you have to make an honest decision with yourself as to whether or not you are going to achieve more if you leave government than if you stay. And that's ultimately what it boils down to. And I have realised in my short time in this place that people will not do anything really difficult until they are made sufficiently uncomfortable to do it. And I'm afraid, irrespective of party and previous loyalties, I will make this government feel as uncomfortable as I possibly can until we deliver for these people, because they deserve someone to go to the wall for them as much as anybody goes to the wall for any of their causes.
Just finishing off very quickly, I'm conscious of time. So I asked you at the beginning how effective you thought this government had been in protecting veterans on the manifesto pledge. How effective do the veteran community think this government's been towards supporting veterans?
It's not great at the moment, but I hope that we can turn that round. The mechanisms are there. The Office for Veterans Affairs, the board that's been set up on the OVA, the links and the work we do. There's some brilliant people in the MOD, Helen Halliwell and others. The structure is all there, but ultimately everything is political. And it needs as much political weight as Brexit, coronavirus. You know, this is not my hobby horse. This is the nation's duty. And we're almost the last country in the world to understand that. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Do you agree, Tommy, that, as I think we would all agree, this is a complex issue for all the reasons we've been talking about for an hour and a half. But despite all of the complexities, it ultimately comes down to political will. It requires a government that has the political will to do it, even if it's difficult, doesn't it?
I mean, that is absolutely correct. You look at Brexit or any of these things that we're all divided on. Okay, there's no legacy policy now that everybody's going to set off fireworks and think is great. This is a difficult area. There are no good press releases to come from this. It's a difficult area that requires leadership. That does not mean we don't do it and we cut these men adrift. So, of course, it's deliverable, but it requires, like I've said a number of times, an ability and statesmanship and leadership that I've not seen to date.
Okay, Mark?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that, unless there are any further questions from my colleagues, I think that brings us to a conclusion. One thing we can, I think, all agree, what unites us is the fact that we should provide support for our veterans. It's so important, if we want to recruit the next generation of armed forces personnel, that we're seen to look after the last generation. And currently what is going on in Northern Ireland is suboptimal, and that's led to your resignation.